7 texts happened within like the same
I knew
5
all my
seconds.
texts.
I grew discouraged to respond.
All right, here we go. The road to revolution, 1763 to 1775. How did we get there? How do we get to a point where we're going to declare independence? That's what we're going to talk about. So it's been building up to this point because the French and Indian War had a significant role in it. But let's start with mercantilism. We know mercantilism, right? We've talked about it several times. So this is kind of a recap, so we'll go quickly. Let me just switch to this mess. So again, belief that wealth was power. You want bullion, gold, silver to stay in the home country. And that's basically the goal. So it's an economic theory. We talked in here, we went into trickle-down economics. We talked about that in ours. We talked about how important economics is. So colonies conferred distinct advantages. Part of the reason we're going to see this imperialism and people starting colonies is because of mercantilism, because they were phenomenal. You could get raw materials from them, and then you could require them to buy your finished goods, to export to them. So work perfectly with mercantilism, keep the gold and silver in your country, while they supply you with raw goods, and then buy your exported goods, your finished goods. So they basically, they say in your textbook, view the American colonies as tenants, like you're renting our land, and we're going to take advantage of that. So we're going to get a various system of laws that will all motivated by mercantilism. So Navigation Law 1650 is created, but not enforced too strictly for a while, so that basically the colonies, all shipping had to be done by Britain. You couldn't, like the colonies couldn't use Dutch ships, French ships, had to be British ships or colonial ships to ship goods. They also, if other countries were going to ship to the colonies, they first had to go up to Great Britain, pay a tariff, pay a tax, and then they could go to the colonies. So everything Britain was controlling, so that all even proceeds from navigation, from ships, would end up in Britain.
So basically just a commerce monopoly.
Yes, very much. There are other products, like tobacco specifically, that Britain said American merchants could only sell. Enumerated products means they could only sell them to Britain. So even though you grow tobacco, you can't sell it to anyone else. It's got to come to us, which obviously is going to cause issues with the price. But what it also did is currency. It had an issue with currency. Because so much gold and silver is ending up in Britain, it was hard to find a way to create currency and have currency in the colonies. And so they would try to print paper money. However, Britain forbid that. So they were prohibited from creating paper currency, and yet they don't have enough gold and silver because Britain's hoarding that. And so they ran into this weird inflation situation where they're trying to create their own currency. Britain's saying they can't, but they're doing it anyway, kind of illegally. But is it worth money or not? So it's very complicated. And ultimately, with all of these, what you want to see is it's creating a frustration for the colonies towards Britain. It's just a growing frustration towards them. Let's see. We'll skip on to the next one. After the 7 Years' War, which is called what in the colonies? French and Indian War. Britain had the largest empire in the world, but also the largest debt in the world. So they won that, but they owed a lot of people a lot of money. And so this is where it's going to, like, they were frustrated with the colonists because they thought, you need to pay more because we protected you. The colonists felt that's Britain's duty to protect us. We don't want to pay more. Ultimately, Prime Minister George Grenville will be tasked with enforcing first those navigation laws. So we're talking 63, those are passed back in the 50s, not strictly enforced. That term salutary neglect, in which Britain did not enforce a lot of the taxes. It's the classic, like as a teacher, they tell you when you start teaching, you have to be strict first and then loosen up. Because if you're loose and then try to tighten up, students rebel. It's exactly what's going on here. Okay, they were loose, then they tried to tighten up, and the colonies will ultimately rebel. So Grenville's going to try to enforce the navigation laws. He's then going to pass the Sugar Act. So again, it's Parliament passing the laws, but him kind of prompting them to do it, and then him enforcing it. And so the Sugar Act was the first law passed by Parliament to raise revenue for the crown from the colonies. Basically, it's a higher price. Anybody flown through the airports internationally and you got those duty-free shops? No? Okay, so if you fly internationally, you'll go through these airports and the big advertisement will be duty-free, 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 which just sounds funny to say. And that's what it says. And it basically means no taxes. You can buy it here free of tax. And that's what that had been going on. But now they're gonna raise the taxes on sugar from the West Indies. The colonies will protest, they'll be kind of heard in that, and they'll lower the tax on it. But then they get the Quartering Act, 1765, required colonies to provide food and quarters for British troops. Again, if you see both sides of it, it's really hard to maintain an army overseas without building barracks and bases and forts. And so, from Britain's standpoint, since we're protecting you, you should house us. That's kind of their thought on it. From the colonial standpoint, it's a frustration to have to provide for these troops. Why are they here? The French are gone. We don't need many of them. And it's intimidating. Like if someone came in and rolled into Ahwatukee with a bunch of soldiers and just walked up into my house and said, give us a place to sleep and some food, that'd be hard. I got 3 daughters. I don't know if I want 4 20-year-old soldiers in my house with 3 daughters. Like there's elements, and then they're eating my food. They probably eat a ton. So they're really frustrated with the Quartering Act. Britain thinks it's totally reasonable. Colonists really frustrated with it. Then they create the stamp tax. And this one's fascinating because basically they're gonna raise revenue again to pay off their debt. They think the colonists should pay this because of defending them with the French and Indian War. And so anything you got, printed, any paper, any letter, you had to buy a stamp for it. And all that money went to Great Britain. So any type of bills of sale, different trade items, you had to pay an additional tax to get that stamp on it. And Grenville saw this as very fair. Britain, people in Britain, citizens of Britain, had to pay a stamp tax, and it was actually less than what they're imposing on the colonies. But the colonies never had to pay one. So to them, it seems ridiculous now that they have to. And to Grenville, he's like, well, you're paying less than they even pay in Britain. So it seemed really reasonable to him. But the Americans are very angry with it. It's what's going to lead to some of the most kind of violent responses from the colonists. This is really what gives the Sons of Liberty their rise, is the reaction to the Stamp Act. So people refused to quarter soldiers and not give them the right amount of food. They passed admiralty courts, Britain did, in which if you didn't follow the Quartering Act or the Stamp Act, you'd be tried in court without a jury and not innocent and proven guilty. You're guilty until proven innocent. Frustrated colonists. Let's get on here. So the big cry is no taxation without representation, which you've heard for a long time. And basically what the book makes a distinction of is the difference between legislation and taxation. The colonies fully believed Parliament could pass laws. They didn't have an issue with that. But they did not think they could tax people that were not represented in Parliament. So they weren't fighting against the laws. The laws made sense. Taxes without representation they felt was unfair. Grenville explained it as virtual representation. Since you're a citizen of Great Britain, you're virtually, like, that you're represented there, even though you're not voting on representation, even though you're not in Great Britain. That's how he saw it. Kind of important, not overly important. Let's get here. So, Stamp Act Congress, 1765. This is kind of one of the first gatherings now in reference to these taxes that's gonna lead kind of the thought of the Constitution, the Continental Congress. So, they got together, they they created a list of grievances of the colonies, they beseeched the king and parliament to repeal the legislation. England totally ignores it. Hey, some of you guys didn't do your primary sources. And you got an old one. You got the one with hippie on it. Where'd you get that one?
I clicked on it like a couple days before, like.
Okay.
So
Before I updated it. Cool.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure it wasn't still hanging out somewhere. I need to update it. bit and talk about it, maybe after the test, so. Together with that stamp Congress, the colonies would consistently try this, non-importation agreements. And if you remember from the video we watched, you saw Adams sitting there and Dickinson's reading, and he's like, he basically says we'll have a non-importation agreement, and John Adams, anybody remember what he says to it? He whispers something under his breath. Yeah, okay, no one will follow it, basically, like, cause it's hard, if everything's coming from Great Britain, you're asking them, the colonists, not to buy their stuff, but they need their stuff. So, he's saying like, yes, we may agree on this, and not buying imported British goods, but the average person, are they really gonna abide by that? But that was an attempt, they tried to basically, boycott British goods.
What was
Very
that
hard.
called too, when they actually succeeded in doing that? Like, it was, like, society said that it was a bad thing if you use British goods.
What was it called? The non-importation agreement, so.
Oh.
Yep. So we know, like, you can even get teapots, and this is in your book, like, no Stamp Act teapot, Stamp Act repealed teapot, so, it's kind of funny. It's funny where things show up to me, so the teapot is a nice place to get a political slogan on, so you can see how much tea they drink. I made some
We'll
tea.
put it on coffee cups?
Yeah, oh, exactly, so, anybody want some tea? I got some tea over there. As much as like it. So, the Forced Repeal of the Stamp Act really credited the Sons of Liberty, Daughters of Liberty, because they took the law into their own hands. They got violent. A lot of these stamp collectors or stamp tax agents fled for their lives. Their houses were threatened. Their family was threatened. Not a single, despite the proclamation, not a single stamp is ever sold in the colonies. Because it gets so violent that when it goes into effect, none of the stamp accountants will sell. They won't, because they're afraid to do it. So by the time the act goes into effect, all stamp agents have been forced to resign. It hurt the British economy, and so they will repeal it, ultimately repeal it. So here's a good picture of what they did to one stamp tax agent here. He's been tarred and feathered, and then they're pouring tea down his throat, and they've got a nice noose hanging there, just to let you know what could really happen if you do this. We probably should watch, I showed my US history class, what a tar and feathering looks like. This looks not terrible, in fact, he just looks like a man bird, right? It's a brutal punishment, because, I mean, tar, having that poured over your body causes second to third degree burns, scars you, like it usually doesn't kill you, but it's pretty difficult. And notice back here, we got the Stamp Act, upside down, over there, so. We'll talk more about political cartoons, how to interpret them later. So, after they repeal the Stamp Act, because their economy's hurt so badly, and they can't sell any anyway, they do pass the Declaratory Act. And basically all it said is, hey, we may have repealed that, but we have the right to tax you. It's just kind of a funny, we're declaring our right to tax you, even though you opposed that and we repealed it because it hurts so much, but we still can tax you. So that gets passed, and we have this kind of continuing confrontation until we get to Townshend Acts, light import duty on glass, white, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Tea is the big one. The colonists still continued to pay any taxes if they didn't have representation. So that leads to the Boston Massacre, as it gets more and more tense, especially in Boston Harbor, about these goods coming in and whether they pay the taxes on them or not. The first episode of John Adams.
Hi Trojan, sorry for the interruption. We have a couple of announcements. Today's birthdays, we have Alexandra Ramirez and Mr. McIntosh, so make sure you wish them a happy birthday. Also, we want to congratulate the cross-country teams who competed last weekend at Freestone Park in Western Equinox Invitational. Racing against 12 teams, the varsity girls placed third, and the varsity boys placed fifth, and the JV boys placed third. Also, congratulations to Kirsten Demblaker and Alyssa Smith, who placed individually in the top 10. Make sure to congratulate them today. Thank you. Have a good lunch.
So that'll lead to the Boston Massacre. The video is great because it really shows how it transpires, and then ultimately, most of those soldiers are found not guilty, and so the big question is whether there's a massacre or not. Your book will show this, and I think it's just pretty brilliant. This is what was drawn by Paul Revere, called the Bloody Massacre. And then later, we will get this painting, if that'll move on, there we go, of it. So what do you notice the difference between the two? What stands out immediately?
Men are closer.
Okay, now you're closer.
One's painting the opponents as a victim, one's saying that they were persecuted.
Okay, so you see them got a club up, here they look much more like a victim. What else do you see?
There's less homelessness, like the guy's black.
Okay, good. So let's focus on that, the guy's black. This one's released closer to the Civil War and abolitionist movement. One of the men that was killed was mulatto, so he's a mix of black and white. And so notice Paul Revere doesn't have him in there, his name was Crispus. But as we got closer to abolition, he was there showing, in fact, he's the closest, that he's one of the leaders.
Attention teachers and students, just a reminder for those students who have pre-ordered their lunch for today through the school service, they can be dismissed now to go pick up their lunch. They will need to enter Barnes Hall from the courtyard. Again, need to enter Barnes Hall through the courtyard. Once they receive their food, they can come out through the double doors. No one is allowed to go through the double doors inside to get their lunch. Thank you.
Okay, so just to say, and then I'll let you, it was significant for the abolitionist movement to show that early on, one of the first conflicts with Britain, people fighting for our rights, was a black man. So, as you go on, you wanna look at the intolerable acts. Those are basically shut down Boston Harbor, following the Boston Tea Party. They shut it down until people paid for the damages, and people refused to. So that's the Boston Report Act as part of the intolerable acts, so be familiar with that. I'm not gonna ask you much about the Quebec Act. There's one back here real fast, sorry. Come on. This is interesting, it's not gonna be on your quiz, so you don't have to know this, but the reaction to the Boston Tea Party was interesting. Because they attacked people's property, there are many people, even George Washington, who was like, this was wrong. Like the Sons of Liberty, if people have a right to property, you can't go onto someone's boat and throw their tea overboard. So not everyone in the colonies was on board with what the Sons of Liberty were doing. They saw them much more, too violent, taking things in their own hands, breaking the law. So we'll stop there, go ahead and grab lunch, quiz tomorrow, chapter 7.
Think about how ironic it is